I remember being in my grandparents' house the day after my grandma died. I rushed home from college. And when I got there, I'd sat in the living room with my grandfather, who had just lost his wife of 60 years. He was smoking in his recliner. And my dad was playing the piano. My dad, his only son, who had just lost his mother. And he was playing just to kind of calm my grandfather. And my grandfather was looking into the distance, the red ember on his cigarette. And I was sitting in Grandma's recliner, where she had always been up until the day before. And Grandpa would, after each song, say, "Nice song, Larry." And then sometimes he would say something like, "Your mother loved that one," and he would cry. And then he would take a puff on his cigarette. And I remember seeing a brochure on the coffee table that the hospital social worker had given him. And it said, "Will I survive this pain?" And I remember thinking it was a good question. There's a poem about death that was written by the great Emily Dickinson. And she describes the scene I just told you about, that scene from the living room. She described it as awful leisure. The awful leisure that follows death. Can you relate to that? There's nothing to do. There's nothing to do. Everything is wrong. Everything feels broken. But there's nothing to do. My grandpa just took another puff on his cigarette. My dad played another song on the piano. And we sat there with the awful leisure. I remember wondering, will my grandpa survive this? A lot of people who've been through grief, like a lot of us here tonight, have experienced what a lot of us would describe as a hole, often in the chest area. It's like I feel like I've got a hole in my chest, and I'm trying to walk around with this hole. One widow said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, going back into public after losing my husband was so hard. She said, I felt like a gap-toothed smile. People only noticed what was missing. They couldn't see what was there, only what wasn't. And I think that causes us to ask ourselves, why isn't God filling this emptiness? Why am I having to have this terrible hole, this emptiness inside of me? Every time I preside at a funeral here, I always begin with two things to say. I say, our job is to celebrate the life of this loved one and to grieve that they've undergone a transition that is going to change our lives forever. We can't get out of either job. We have to celebrate and we have to grieve. Because if we don't celebrate, we won't be giving our loved ones their due. And if we don't grieve and mourn, we're setting ourselves up for a terrible road ahead. So we have to do both of those things. And to do that in the midst of the awful leisure of losing someone feels impossible. And that's why we come here. Because for God, everything is possible. It's even possible to find our way through this. Something important for all of us to know, especially if you are someone who is here with a loss that happened this past year, is that you only have one job to do tonight and in this chapter of your life. If you're suffering a fresh loss, your only job is to survive this. You just have to survive it. You don't have to do it beautifully or perfectly. You don't have to impress us with your strength or your wit. You don't have to do anything profound that someone's going to write in a memoir. You just have to survive it. You have to not let it take you. You have to somehow keep living in the midst of all of this. And we never know when it's going to happen. Deacon Dave was getting all ready for this Mass tonight, and then he lost his brother yesterday. That's part of being human, isn't it? The losses come, and we don't know when. I had a friend who went through a terrible loss. I knew it was terrible. It wasn't one that I'd ever had before, so I knew it was beyond my understanding, but I could only imagine how rough it was. After about 3 years, I said to her, I noticed that you seem to be doing better. I don't know if you don't want to talk about it, it's okay, but can you tell me, how are you getting through this? And she said, I started to realize that my grief was not going to shrink. So I was going to have to expand. Can you relate to that? This grief is not going to get smaller. I have to get bigger. If I want to be able to hold this, if I want to be bigger than the hole in my chest, I have to expand. I'm going to have to find a way to hold it. Because expecting it to shrink sometimes isn't what people experience. You may say, I've been waiting for this to get easier. I've been waiting for this grief to shrink. For some of us, we have to admit it's not going to shrink. We have to expand. I have a friend who's a priest down in Clifton Park, Father Dan McHale. A lot of you might know him. He's a great guy. And he had a cousin named Brian who died in a car accident about 20 years ago. In fact, it's long enough ago, it was before I knew Father Dan. I've gotten to know a lot of Father Dan's family over the years that we've been friends, and the first time I met his Aunt Joanne, I realized, oh my gosh, this is Brian's mother. This is the mother of the guy who died in the car accident. And she was so warm, so easy to talk to. And so we had this kind of connection where I thought I could take a risk. And I said, if you don't want to talk about it, it's okay. But I'm just wondering, it seems like you have so much joy and you're so, alive. How have you been able to hold that and go through the loss of your son? And she said, I had to accept that Brian had a short life. She said, but I wouldn't trade him for another son who had a longer life. And then she said, once I admitted that I wouldn't trade any of this, even if I could, I started feeling more strength than I ever felt before. Because I realized if I wouldn't trade it, then I have to find some acceptance in this. Whoever you're thinking of tonight, whoever is up here on this altar of remembrance, whoever is maybe not up here but is in your heart, we have to understand that as much grief as we feel that much love and more. And so we have to maybe admit to ourselves that if we wouldn't trade that love for another love that would have lasted longer, then we're starting the path of acceptance. If we say, I could have had another person who would have had a longer life and would be here right now, but if it wouldn't be my Brian or my whoever it is, then I wouldn't do it. I only want my loved one, my spouse, my child. I wouldn't trade my child for another child who lived longer. It wouldn't be worth it. It's hard to even use the word acceptance when it comes to death. because it sounds wrong. It sounds like we're agreeing with it, or like we're approving of what happened. And that's why one psychologist says, she goes, acceptance is what we're aiming at. She said, but I find that the word doesn't work for a lot of people because it sounds like you're approving of the thing, or you've made peace with it, or it's okay with you now. You see that it's for the best. And she said, so I don't use the word acceptance. I say, we're here to get a little bit more comfortable with the things we can't change. Instead of saying accepting it, she says, I'm getting more comfortable with this thing that I can't change. I don't know how we're supposed to get more comfortable with having a great big hole in the middle of us, but that is the challenge that we're being asked to consider. And as we're trying to get more comfortable with this hole, we're trying to figure out, God, can't you fill this with something? Can't you fill this emptiness that I feel? And I think we need to ask ourselves, what if God is keeping it empty on purpose? What if that is now the place where you're going to meet that person for the rest of your life? What if that's your meeting place with them? What if that place is reserved for them alone? So it's like a sanctuary. It's like a chapel inside of you. What if that's not meant to be filled, but is meant to be kept empty? I heard an interview with a dad of a child who was killed at Sandy Hook in 2012, that horrible day. And he talked about the hole in his heart, and he said, my child makes me a better person. He said, because I've got this great big hole in my heart. And he said, because my child's absence made that hole, I'm forced to keep it covered with love to protect it. I always keep that hole covered with love to protect it. And so my child continues to make me a better dad by covering my heart with protective love. Our only job right now is to survive. It's to go to bed tonight and to wake up tomorrow. It's to keep putting one foot in front of the other. That is the only job we have. And part of surviving that means if we have a good day, we have to give ourselves permission to have a good day. Part of surviving means that some days we actually feel a little lightness for the first time. And we might feel too guilty to feel it. We might say, how can I be lighthearted today when I've lost my beloved? But we've got to know that they do not get honored by increasing our suffering. They want for us to find our footing. They want for us to survive. And they want for us to take as long as we need to. And they want us to be able to feel a good day when it comes. And maybe it's followed by a terrible day after that. And then maybe the following week, there's 2 good days that week. We don't know. Or maybe it's not a full day. Maybe it's just a morning that isn't so hard. Or an evening that has a little bit of lightness to it. Or we find ourselves watching TV or doing something, and for a millisecond, we weren't thinking about it. And we're surprised. Our loved ones want that for us. Because they've been on this journey. They know what pain is like. Many of the people we're grieving tonight had carried grief with them for years, especially some of the older ones. They had carried so many losses with them. We're being encouraged to let go of worrying about them and how they're doing and to focus on surviving. Because one thing our faith tells us, if you're able to muster the faith during this hard time, is that they're fine. There was a great poem written by the poet Hafiz 700 years ago. And this is what he said about heaven. He said, if you were in heaven and you started crying, everyone would laugh. because they would know you were just kidding. If you were in heaven and you started crying, people would laugh. They would know you're just kidding. Part of surviving is allowing our loved ones to be happy in glory. Tonight is our permission slip that we're writing for ourselves, and God is going to sign, that give us permission to allow our loved ones to be in glory and to be relieved of all the struggles that we experience on earth. And we give ourselves permission to, at least for tonight, not make it our job to worry all the time if they're okay, but to know that we can trust that God's got this, that our going home to heaven is not a mistake in the plan. It is the plan. It's how all of us allow life to unfold before us. Our job is not to try to figure anything out tonight. To survive this pain, to somehow make it to tomorrow, that is our only job.